This event has been organized by the Data Ethics and Governance section at the Royal Statistical Society. The section remit is to promote good practice and coordinate data governance interests across the RSS and the UK landscape, as well as offer international leadership. We also aim to engage members and non-members to think more broadly about the impact of new uses of data in our society and how this affects professional responsibilities. Oh, why is it? Okay, so if you would like to know more about our work and future events, please visit our website, sign up to our newsletter, and follow us on LinkedIn. I will pop all of this in the chat, so no need to take any notes. We will be recording the event. If you have any objections, please pop into the chat and we will make sure we will edit the recording before publishing. And during the presentations, please make sure you turn off your camera and mute yourself so we can ensure no noise. We have 3 fantastic speakers. We have here today with us Zoe Slade, who is a data scientist at the Ministry of Justice, and will speak about ethical consideration in data linkage with Splink. Afterwards, we will hear from Dr. Michael Cattell, Ethics Fellow at the Alan Turing Institute, who will present an ethical framework for data science and AI in the criminal justice system. And we will end with a presentation from Joy, from Joy Aston, Policy Advisor at the Responsible Technology Adoption Unit, formerly known as the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation, about the Algorithmic Transparency Recording Standard. After each presentation, we will have time for questions. Please you can either pop your questions in the chat, or if you're brave enough, unmute yourself and ask the question. My colleague, the section Job, and myself will do our best to monitor the chat. However, if we are not able to go through all the questions, we will ask the speakers if they could share their email address for follow-up questions. You're not here to listen me speaking, so let's pass it on to Zoe.
Great, thank you, Adela. All right, I'll just share my screen. So you should be able to see that now, hopefully. Let me know if you can't see it.
All good.
Great. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name's Zoe Slade. I'm a data scientist at the Ministry of Justice. Today, I'm going to be talking about the ethical considerations arising in the work that we do within data linking. So I'm excited to give you a somewhat rare opportunity to get a look into real work currently going on at the Ministry of Justice and the various ethical considerations that come into play. But before I get started on the ethics side of things, first some context. So what is data linking? Data linking, also sometimes referred to as entity resolution, is the process of linking records which lack a unique identifier. So let's say we're interested in linking people. This would mean that we're trying to identify whether data records, like the example ones we have here, belong to the same person. So we have IDs such as NHS number and national insurance number, and these can do a really good job at identifying people. However, these IDs, like most other information in these administrative data sets that we're dealing with, can be inconsistently recorded, incomplete, or perhaps missing altogether. So they're not perfect, and this is why we need another way to link up data. But why do we need to link data at all? Well, having linked up data means that we can consistently identify people across justice system services, and therefore we can better understand people's interactions with and journeys through the justice system. The work that we do is part of the Data First project. This is funded by ADR UK, who are aiming to create a sustainable body of knowledge on justice system users. And it's also now supported by the BOLD programme. So to solve the data linking challenges that we face at the MOJ, we built our own data linking software, and this is called Splink. Splink works at much greater scale and is much faster than other versions of data linking software out there. And this makes it capable of linking the large-scale justice data sets that we need to work with. It's also flexible and customizable, so it comes with a lot of configuration options, and this means it can be adapted to all the different data sets we deal with as well. So I'm not going to go into the details about how Splink works, and that's not because it's a black box model, I promise you, but because we really want to get onto the ethical considerations of data linking with Splink. However, I will give a brief explanation of what Splink does. So, in a nutshell, Splink compares pairs of records and predicts the likelihood of these records belonging to the same person. So, if we take our hypothetical example from before, Splink predicts here that there's a 95% chance of these records belonging to the same person. So, Splink is a predictive model. It does this by implementing the Faligi-Sunter methodology of record linkage. So it's a statistical model, and it uses the expectation maximization algorithm to perform unsupervised machine learning. And if you'd like to know more about the details of how Splink works, then please do check out our documentation. There's a link to it there on the slides, and I'm happy to share it, a link to that also in the chat after the talk. So far at the Ministry of Justice, we've used Splink to link up data from across courts, prisons, and probation services. So that's kind of the whistle-stop tour of the data linking and the Splink part. Hopefully I've given you enough background there. But what about the ethics? So throughout developing the Splink software and also using it to link up justice system data, we've come up against many ethical considerations, 3 of which I'm going to share with you now, and also together with how we are addressing them and some challenges that we're yet to overcome. So starting then with transparency of software and tools. So having transparent software and tools means that the inner workings, in other words, the code, are visible and accessible. So how are we addressing this? The key way is by open sourcing the code for our Splink software. So we do this by hosting the code on a public GitHub repository, and this makes it visible and accessible across the world. But I just want to make it very clear here that I'm only talking about open sourcing the code that underlies Splink itself, not the code that uses Splink. That would be a data linking model, because these are usually based on sensitive data. So that's not what we're open sourcing. And also open sourcing code is not always possible to do within government work, and for various reasons, including security, compliance, etc. But where it is possible to open source code, it can really help in many ways to uphold high ethical standards within analytical work in government. So what does open sourcing code mean for ethics specifically then? For one, it promotes analytical best practice. So working in the open increases the opportunity for public scrutiny and our level of accountability. And whilst this can feel pretty scary sometimes, it also really does help to promote and maintain high levels of quality. So as one example, following open source best practices includes building automated and self-documenting tests into software. These run automatically whenever changes are made to code. So this makes the software robust. It means we can ensure that it is performing reliably and consistently under various different conditions without crashing or producing incorrect results. And demonstrating analytical best practice is essential for gaining public trust and confidence, not only in the actual software itself, but in the humans that are behind building it. So another key benefit of open sourcing code is transparency of change. Open sourcing our code with GitHub means that we can establish a visible audit trail of changes that we're making to the software. This also means that we can document decisions and make this a seamless part of the development process. And furthermore, it's really important for maintaining public trust. Another thing that opening up code enables is feedback. So perhaps there are places where the implementation of the underlying algorithm is confusing or perhaps obscure, but by enabling feedback and opening up to feedback and listening to that feedback, we can then make targeted improvements to the code and our documentation to improve the explainability of models built using Splink. And then last but not least, open sourcing code means that we can use public money responsibly. So if we open up our technology, it means that we can enable others to apply it to solve their own data linking problems. So this means we can reduce the duplication of effort and other people also building like many different versions of data linking software and lots of different government departments. It also means that other departments are less inclined to rely on external bodies who can provide proprietary software, and this can often be opaque and can also come with a hefty price tag. So the next ethical consideration is explainability. So explainability refers to the ability to understand and articulate how decisions or predictions made by machine learning models are reached. And having explainable models is essential to support informed decision making and for public trust. And we're addressing this in two main ways. The first is interactive charts, and the second is documentation. So interactive charts help really lift the lid on each stage of the data linking process. For example, we produce match weight charts during model training. This shows how much evidence each field in the data record provides for or against records being a match. We also have a waterfall chart showing how this evidence combines to give the final predicted match probability. Being able to interrogate predictions is especially valuable when things go wrong. So if an incorrect link has been made, then this means you can trace it back to see exactly why the model made the decision to link the two records. And secondly, importantly, these charts are automated, automatically generated as a standard part of our data linking pipeline. So they're not an afterthought. The second way in which we address explainability is documentation. So documentation is understandably something that's thought of as quite boring or laborious, but as we all know, it's very important. And by being open source, actually part of our documentation is already kind of taken care of from being on the GitHub code base, because this comes with pull requests or issues. It's very easy to make documentation part of the development process, but it's not enough on its own. So the algorithm underpinning the data linking models built using Splink is called the Foliggi-Sunter model of record linkage. So this is an industry standard and well-researched methodology. So it's fundamentally an explainable model, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's easy to understand for the layperson or that it's obvious how this model is actually implemented through Splink. So we have built up extensive documentation, including tutorials and topic guides, to really try and lay out the nuts and bolts of the algorithm in a clear and accessible way. There is even a blog article on ethics included in the documentation. So again, I'll post a link in the chat after the talk if you'd like to check that out. And then just like our code, this documentation is open and it's public facing. In fact, it actually lives as part of that GitHub repository alongside the code. This makes it more visible and easy to reach. but also really importantly, again, it makes it open to feedback. And we do have a lot of interactions with users, pointing out places where things might not be explained in the clearest way. And this is really valuable for us. So whilst the documentation might not be the most fun part of the job, it has been really valuable in building trust with our users and stakeholders. So the last consideration I'm going to cover is model evaluation. So what does this mean? So being able to understand and explain how a model has reached its final prediction is crucial, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the decision it's reached is accurate or fair. And this is really the challenge of model evaluation. And model evaluation is really critical if we're to have confidence and trust in the quality of the model and also its predictions. So I'm going to cover two key areas of evaluation. The first is evaluating model predictions, and the second is evaluating bias. So just as for explainability, we have a range of tools and practices that we follow to support quality assurance of results. One of these is clerical review. So this involves humans manually reviewing a representative sample of the link record and deciding whether they should be linked. And performing this kind of review is especially important when working with unsupervised machine learning models, because we don't start with labeled data. So the clerical review establishes a sort of ground truth, which outputs can then be compared to. And this enables us to produce performance metrics for models and decide on truth thresholds. So a threshold above which we decide the record should be linked. And this can help us reduce the number of false links that we create, so false positives, or mislinks, in other words, false negatives. And a big part of this is having open and honest communication. We're never going to achieve perfectly linked data. And with the scales of the data sets that we're dealing with, so tens of millions of rows, there are going to be false links formed at some point, links we've got wrong. And we also are going to miss some links. There are going to be false negatives. There's no way to avoid these completely. And there's always going to be uncertainty in the results. But it's so important to be transparent on the limitations of the model and its results. It's just very important for analytical integrity and trust. So this is a very important part of our evaluation process. We haven't solved all the problems, though, so there are still a lot of challenges. One of the virtues of Splink, which I mentioned at the beginning, is that it's highly configurable, so it's very flexible. This is great because it means that it can be adapted to deal with lots of different data sets and use cases. However, with this greater flexibility also comes more choice when it comes to model design, and it isn't trivial to unpick all the interplaying factors that impact model results. And this is something we're currently working on and to see if we can do better at. Evaluating models also means evaluating bias. So bias is a key area of ethical concern within data linking, and it's one that actually crops up at many stages during a typical data linking project. So these biases can have unintended consequences for the resulting linked data, and that can have implications on fairness when it comes to decision making based on the linked data. So bias can be already present in the source data. For example, a higher occurrence of misspellings for names of names of non-UK origin that's happened during the data collection process, so very much upstream of the data linking, that can have then downstream consequences for the accuracy of links formed. Bias can also be introduced into models from the decisions we make on how to compare fields within the records. So as an example, a double demetaphone comparison on names may use an algorithm that is only trained on English phonetics. And so as a result, names which deviate from those English phonetic norms may be compared incorrectly. And this can also lead to inaccurate links for certain people. And these are just two kind of sources of data, sources of bias that I've mentioned here, but there are many more. So one thing is that it's really important to recognise that it's rarely possible to eliminate bias entirely, and also that these sources of bias can be very specific to a given use case. And therefore, that makes it very challenging to find general solutions to mitigating bias. So it's not possible to come up with a one-size-fits-all approach. However, this year we're embarking on a bias and data linking project in collaboration with the Alan Turing Institute internship scheme to get expert support on assessing bias in our linking pipelines. So the long-term goal here is to create general tooling to help Splink users gain better understanding of how bias could be introduced into their models and could be affecting their results. So that's it from me. Thank you for joining me on this whistle-stop tour of ethical considerations of data linking. To summarise then, open sourcing government work brings many positive benefits for upholding ethical standards within analytical work, but being transparent is more than just making our code visible. It's also about being clear about how we're using our models and how they reach their decisions. So related to that, if we as analysts have the ability to build these powerful machine learning models, then we can also apply that same innovative spirit to find technological solutions to lift the lid on them and champion explainability. It's also really important to be open and honest about the limitations of our models, what they can't tell us, and any biases that might be at play. And this is really important for maintaining integrity and trust. And being open also means admitting where we don't have all the answers and opening ourselves up to scrutiny and also feedback so that we can continue to improve the services that we're providing to the public. And I'd just like to end by saying thank you to the two teams you're going to hear from next. First of all, the Alan Turing Institute, whose work with the MAJ has really helped shape a lot of the thinking we've done in this space. And the Responsible Technology Adoption Unit, formerly the CDEI, and the Central Digital and Data Office for supporting public sector organisations in addressing algorithmic transparency. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Zoe, for your presentation. It's fantastic, and the fact that you are thinking ahead of the ethical limitations is very important. And I know Splink is a marvelous project that is used across government. Many other departments have used Splink for linkage of data, and it's generally a fantastic project. I will invite questions if you have for Zoe. As I said, you can either pop them in the chat or unmute yourself and ask the question. Maybe until people type any questions, I'll go and ask a question because I was quite curious about. You've mentioned it's true that with the source data, the quality you can't do much, that you could just advocate for better quality of data, and that will probably boost performance. It will probably reduce bias. However, you said there are plans for a project with the Alan Turing Institute for evaluating more the model bias. What sort of things will you be looking at? Is there anything, is it a defined project, or I'm just curious what sort of things are in the future?
Yeah, so it's largely undefined at the moment, but we have the intern starting next week, so we're going to get going on all of that soon. There will be definitely a place to think about and you are right when you say there's not much you can do with the source data, like we are not directly involved in the data collection process, so there's not much we can do there, but we can assess and quantify the bias in the data that we're putting into the model. So that'll be part of the work, quantifying that bias and communicating that to users, and especially users of our linked data. And then there's a bit more of a kind of knotty place where we would want to assess how the choices in model design and the choices we're making when it comes to building the model are impacting the bias in the data. And then there's the third bit of seeing what bias exists in the outputs. So whether we are overrepresenting some groups, whether we've got more accurate links for some groups, and things like that. So it's kind of, we're going to be looking at bias across the whole data linking pipeline. Don't know the details of it yet, but yeah, it's part of the bigger evaluation work.
Yeah, I'm guessing it also depends on how much actual information you have about the data, because if you only have a name and something is not, you can't really evaluate much there. So I'm guessing it really depends also on the data set, no?
Absolutely, yeah. And there's a big variation in data quality across the different data sets we deal with.
Amazing, thank you so much. Any other questions? I see a hand raised. Yes, Job?
Hi, Della. Thanks, Zoe, for that really interesting presentation. You mentioned inviting feedback a few times. I just wondered, could you give a couple of examples of where that feedback's helped you improve explainability or break down these obscure algorithms? You mentioned those two things.
So the ways in which we collect feedback are numerous. So I think having GitHub as a platform is so useful. We have GitHub discussions. I mean, if you want to go to the GitHub repo, we've got discussion boards. That's a really good way to interact with people who are actually using the software. There's also issues, so if people find problems, and it can be in terms of the documentation as well, they can raise them there, and then we can have communication with people that are using the software. Sometimes it might be just through emails or giving presentations like this and getting feedback. I can't think of many examples where, like specific examples off the top of my head. Probably should have looked at the GitHub repo before this. One that came up recently, and this is actually linked to ethics, is that, do you remember the waterfall chart I showed? So those charts, we didn't have an anonymized version of those. And that was some feedback we got, because for people to do a general presentation on Splink, let's say they're trying to sell it to their stakeholders or customers, and they want to adopt this technology, if they might have to use sensitive data to produce that chart, because it shows a record to record comparison where you have potentially personally identifying information. So that was something that was raised. Can we have an anonymized version of this waterfall chart so that we've got something we can lift and shift and put in a slide pack, basically to sell, like to encourage people to uptake this thing without having to share sensitive data. So hopefully that's a good enough example.
It is, thanks.
Michael?
Yes, hello. It's great to be sharing this presentation time with Zoe. We've worked together a bit on various ethics projects, and it's great to see that you've joined the Splink team, which is a project that we have a particular interest in, and have enjoyed learning about its journey from conception to instantiation. And then one thing, I just was going to ask you something. I remember from my time working with Splink that there was the team was aware of people adapting using the GitHub code and adapting and creating their own data linking algorithms for their own purposes. And I was just wondering if you had any knowledge of any use cases in which that had taken place, and any things that had come up, or just any stories at all about that you might know about that we could share. Thanks.
Yeah, so we've had quite a lot of uptake, different teams using Splink, also using the linked data. I think one success story that comes to mind is with the local councils, and we've been working more and more with local councils to help them join up their data. So Lewisham Council have recently used Splink to identify more families who are eligible to receive free school meals. So by linking up I think it was about 500 families that they wouldn't have had that access because the data wasn't linked up. So that's a great success story. We've got others actually on the homepage of the Splink documentation. There's various use cases. It is also used by people across the world. So it's not just government or local government, researchers, whoever needs to link their data. It's being used all over the world, which is fantastic. Another great benefit of being open source. The BOLD programs, that stands for Better Outcomes Through Linked Data. They have linked up health data and with justice system data, and that's been really helpful to enable people to access more alcohol and drug rehabilitation services. So that's another one that comes to mind. Yeah, they're the ones I can think of off the top of my head. There's many, many more.
Very interesting application. Okay. We will move forward for our next presentation. Thank you so much, Zoe. If you have further questions in the chat, please put them in the chat. Zoe, if you wouldn't mind sharing your email address just in case people would like to get in touch with other questions or comments or thoughts. And we will moving now to Michael, who will be presenting an ethical framework for data science and AI in the criminal justice system.
Okay, I'm experimenting with all the best features of Teams, so hopefully you can see my slide presentation.
Yes.
Fantastic, and you can still see it if I do this, right? Nothing's changed. Great, good, then it's working as designed. That's wonderful, so rare. So yes, so thank you, Zoe, for your excellent presentation. Zoe's presentation focuses on a very specific project and the work that her team did to think through a lot of ethical considerations in the development and use of Splink, which is excellent. And we actually learned a lot ourselves during our time collaborating with the MOJ and talking to people on the Splink team about their path through ethical deliberation. So what I'm going to talk about today is a framework and toolkit that the Alan Turing Institute, where I am, developed in cooperation with the Ministry of Justice, and it's a bit more high level in how it approaches things, but hopefully you'll see how it maybe connects a little bit to Zoe's presentation and the work that they've done.
You are muted. Still muted.
Very embarrassing. Okay, hello everyone. I'm back. So I'll begin again. Sorry about that. So today what I'm presenting on is an ethical framework for data science and AI in the criminal justice system. It actually connects very closely to the presentation that Zoe just gave, because the Splink project was actually a sort of a test case and a sounding board that we used when developing the project I'm going to talk about today. So give a quick outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to give a little bit of background on the project that we did, and then talk about the guiding principles that we use to frame and develop an ethical framework, and then talk a bit more about how those principles we were able to take them from high level, somewhat abstract ideas and try to turn them into actionable concepts. And close with a brief look at some of the tools that we co-developed with our colleagues at the Ministry of Justice for reflection and ethical deliberation. So first, the background. In 2019, my colleague David Leslie published a very impactful publication called "Understanding Artificial Intelligence, Ethics and Safety: A Guide for the Responsible Design and Implementation of AI Systems in the Public Sector," which is quite a mouthful. We usually just refer to it as the Public Sector Guidance. It has proven to be a very popular publication among public sector agencies, both within the UK and actually all over the world. It's a very widely cited set of guidance. And essentially what it tries to do is, and it may have been the first time that someone had gone to the work of first, articulating a set of ethical principles that could guide the ethical design, development, and deployment of data-driven systems like AI and data science projects, with practical guidance. So rather than simple abstractions and simple ideals, practical guidance that project members, project teams could undertake to implement ethical projects in the world. This was developed in conjunction with the Office for AI and the Government Digital Service, and also with input and support from the Ministry of Justice. Riding on the success of this publication, UKRI funded a multi-year project in which we collaborated with the Ministry of Justice to target this ethical framework for specific application in the criminal justice system. Understanding that the criminal justice system, well, like any government agency, but in particular, criminal justice has some specific and unique needs that need to be accounted for in any sort of ethical framework at all. And so, in general, what the project was intended to produce was a set of principles and tools for ethical reflection and deliberation. That sounds very tools and resources that would give project teams a structured way of thinking through the ethical issues that would confront them as they were developing and deploying technical systems. So rather than after the fact thinking of developing a system and then going back and trying to decide what their ethical obligations were, thinking ahead, thinking at the earliest stages of a project to get out ahead and proactively develop ethical systems. We recognize in this project that the criminal justice system has some unique and extraordinary duties, tasks, and obligations, and the stakeholders to the criminal justice system are vast. They're everyone from the victims of crime to the accused, to people serving time in prison, to people working, to members of the judiciary, probation officers, and a large number of rank and file workers throughout the system, and then the general public, right? So the criminal justice system is vast, and the responsibilities for those who work in it is similarly vast. So we understood that generic and standard engineering standards would not work for project teams who were developing tools, or they'd be insufficient. They would be just limited. A big part of the project, what we did is we actually took a social science approach at first, which was to conduct a great deal of stakeholder engagement to understand from people who are in the criminal justice system in one way or another, what these systems, what technical systems or data-driven systems might mean for them. The project was curtailed somewhat because of the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic, but we were still able to hold a rich variety of interviews and workshops with heads of profession at the MOJ, rank and file workers, members of the judiciary, and probation officers. We also had the excellent assistance and support of the chief data ethicist, Alex Facio, who joined during the project, and also a group of ethics champions, of which Zoe Slade is one, who we convened in 2022 to help us refine to basically provide consultation on the project and engage in co-design activities. So I do want to move to talking about the ethical principles that guide and motivate this system. These are mainly drawn from the work of the public sector guidance that I mentioned a few slides ago, but this is a set of principles that we sort of revise and refine as we go, including changing the name periodically. It used to be called the fast track principles, now they're the safety principles, but the fundamentals are the same. So the key principles here are sustainability, accountability, fairness, explainability, and data stewardship. And then also implied in the safety principles is that of safety, hence the clever title, right? Now, these are high-minded principles that we need to figure out how to use in practice. It's all well and good to have an idea of fairness or data stewardship, but how do you take action on that? How do you make decisions based on high-minded principles? And that's not clear at all. So what we provided, some of the tools we provided, and I can't go into full detail of this whole framework and toolkit because it's rather lengthy, but one was to develop a model of a project lifecycle for like an AI or data-driven system project to scaffold reflection, basically give a way of an entry point for people to have a set of agreed language, an understanding about how the process might transpire in the course of a data-driven technology project, and then a procedure for operationalizing ethical principles, and what that means. Turning them into something useful, like taking these high-minded principles and making them contextually relevant to where they're meant to act, and also to help refine how one might actually take real world action on them. And then ultimately, also a big piece of this framework was a methodology for constructing, reviewing, communicating what we call assurance cases, which are basically forms of documentation to demonstrate, to be accountable and say, we went through this ethical process, and these are some of the questions we asked and how we answered them. Because no ethical project, no system of ethics can ever be totally complete. A system of ethics is really just a set of strategies for trying to make the best decisions with the information that you have to hand, and then being accountable about those decisions, being able to show your work, being able to tell people, we made certain decisions, we had reasons, we assembled evidence, this is why we made this decision. And so hopefully we achieved that. So core to some of the methodology that we use is what we would call operationalization. So the safety principles means taking, having a specification, understanding that we need to take this grandiose idea of ethics and somehow specify it into the work that we are doing right now. And then by doing so, translate that hopefully into some practical guidance that will then guide decision-making and also guide accountability and governance functions to back up those decisions down the line. Core to this is what we call the AI project lifecycle, or sometimes called the socio-technical lifecycle. This is a graphic that represents some of the key features of the development of an AI project. Now, it's just a model. It's just one model of many, but we did consult many people on the components that should be part of this model, including the members of the Splink team, for example. And we've broken it into basically 3 segments. So looking at that circle, you'll see if you look on the upper right, starting at noon, we have the project design phase, and then we move through model development and into system deployment. But you see that it's a circle that repeats, because what we understand is that most data-driven projects are iterative. Many of them exist in continuous development. Also, it should be understood that even though we've drawn this neat little circle here, it's also understood that projects don't actually necessarily run in this particular order. Some things take place in parallel. Some things take place in orders that are not listed here. But the goal of having a model like this is to create or provide a shared vocabulary for multidisciplinary teams and organizations, and a way to scaffold ethical reflection and deliberation. In other words, a way to meet somewhere and say, we need to talk about something that's going on in this project. I think it actually falls into system implementation. And if it does, well, that may actually inherit something from earlier on, like model selection and training. And being able to name those things while having these deliberations and discussion helps to clarify and bring a little bit and refine the discussion somewhat. Right, so moving on. So we have this. So we have this helpful model, and we have the set of principles that I just mentioned. So what do we do with these? Well, to operationalize the safety principles, any one of the principles, means to take a principle like fairness. Fairness is a perfect one to use to illustrate this point. Because fairness means a lot of things. It can mean different things to different people, and it can encompass a lot of other things as well. It's a principle potentially of many principles. So to understand and think about fairness, project teams need to sit back and think for a second, perhaps by consulting with others. What do we mean by fairness? What do we mean? What are the priorities of fairness for this particular project, for this particular set of stakeholders, for this particular audience or customer? Here's just a few examples. Fairness could be expressed through bias mitigation. It could be expressed through ensuring that there's diversity and inclusion. It could be expressed through non-discrimination. It could be expressed as equality. This is just a short list. The list could go on and on. So I can say that operationalizing an ethical principle can be a complicated task, and the list could be quite long. And which is not to say that one needs to be able to operationalize every last aspect of every last ethical principle. But the important thing is to try, is to start from somewhere. So this is a place to start. So thinking about bias mitigation, for example, bias mitigation, Zoe mentioned bias as being an issue for the ethical deliberations in Splink. It's a very common issue that comes up in data-driven systems, in technical systems in general, but particularly in data-driven systems. There are no data-driven systems that exist that are in any way free of bias. So that means that mitigating bias, which means basically managing it, is one way to minimize unwanted and undesirable impacts of systematic deviations, distortions, disparate outcomes, basically ethical failures. So it's a place to work. It's a place to start. And then we need to think, well, how might we go about mitigating bias? Well, to assist with that, in the project, we provided a set of tools, and included among those tools is something called a bias self-assessment. Now, although it sounds like something that you're supposed to do by looking in the mirror and asking yourself questions about how biased you are, it's not exactly what we mean by a bias self-assessment. Bias self-assessment means that you yourself can go through the project life cycle and think through how biases might play into various aspects, various activities that take place during the life of a project. And so what we buy a bias taxonomy that breaks down bias into three general categories: social, statistical, and cognitive bias, which are widely recognized categories of different types of bias. These are all different types of bias. Some can be some that are just sort of baked into the numbers or baked into the way we interpret numbers, but many others are more in the social realm, meaning because so much data emerges from social life, from social activity, from human activity, social biases are rife within data sets, and they're very hard to, almost impossible really to entirely remove. And so we must merely deal with them in some way and then consider them. That's basically the extent of our duties as ethicists, is to attempt to overcome the harms of bias. So just an example of some of the biases here. Among them are the social biases, like I mentioned. One example is annotation bias. So when we think of an example like, I don't know, a prison system or an A&E in a hospital. Right? You have people whose job is not necessary to be data analysts or computer scientists in any way, who are tasked with recording or tracking a great deal of data about the people that they interact with. Think in terms of, A&E is probably a very accessible example. Many of us have been to the A&E, and you know how harried and frenzied and overworked A&E staff can be. And then you task them with meticulously filling out some sort of form with detailed information about patients. And you might imagine a lot of things can be overlooked, a lot of mistakes can be made. There can be design problems with the form itself and how questions are posed. And the result is you can have data that has been annotated quite poorly, or in some cases annotated with lots of data not even there. And these biases then are rolled into your data set, and these annotation problems can be replicated hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of times, and be evident in the data that you're now trying to work with. I note actually in Zoe's presentation, she looked at two records being linked. Attempting the example records of linkage in Splink, and there was a difference in date of birth and city of residency. Date of birth is a great example where a mistyped number could change everything and could cause a piece of data to suddenly no longer become particularly accurate. Statistical biases are probably more familiar to this audience. These are biases that just enter into the picture because no data is perfect, and that these have carry-on effects as you try to do anything involving maths on this work. An example is training server skew. Was when a model was deployed on individuals whose data are not similar or representative of the individual whose data were used to train, test, and validate the model. Now, thinking about that, this is a problem, I think, in, say, economics and all sorts of statistical work, in which we think we have a pretty good model of the world, and then we try to apply it to some context for which the model wasn't really considered or didn't really understand all the factors present there. And then the model that works so well on paper and back in the laboratory no longer functions, no longer seems to predict what we hoped it would predict. There are a lot of cognitive biases. Just the way that we think and the way that people think plays a role in how data is collected. I mean, this is hard to control for. If humans are part of the process of producing data, then they're likely their failings, their limitations, their humanness is going to be reflected in how the data is actually shaped. So semantic bias is an example when discriminatory inferences are allowed to go through the model and remain some sort of element of the productionalized system. And this is just simply the use of language that we think that some language is perfectly descriptive in some place, and we fail to understand that our own personal biases about things may shift how language actually describes something in the world. So, for example, identifying a woman as aggressive based on some set of behaviors, for which the same behaviors might be exhibited or might be described as assertive in a man. Right? This is fairly, I think a lot of people who study gendered data will recognize this, that we use different ways of describing the same behavior in different people. So how do we use this? So how the bias self-assessment is meant to guide us on going back through the project lifecycle and seeing where these various biases might show up. So we might see, say, some social bias, some annotation bias show up in data extraction and procurement or data analysis. We maybe are overconfident in the data that we have, or we fail to take into account the conditions under which the data was collected that may actually shift its accuracy and usefulness and give us and provide a lot more emphasis on data cleaning. Things like the training server skew might go to system implementation when we think about how to apply a particular project in a particular population, and then we fail to account for the specifics of that population. Similarly, any of the biases mentioned could go to the design of the model itself, thinking about what features to include, and also, throughout this whole part of the both design and development aspect, this particular corner, thinking about how our models are accounting for the biases that are likely to be present in the data, and whether or not we basically have enough features and enough questions being asked by the model that can be answered so that it can do its best work and make its best predictions. So that's a very, very rapid overview of what I might say, again, was a very lengthy project, but I just want to give you some optimistic views about this project. First of all, we at the Turing, we finished our main work on this framework and toolkit with what we might call a feature complete draft, which is another way of saying it was not quite done, but we ran out of funding, but we did what we could, and we think it was an excellent project, and we learned a lot along the way. And we made a lot of friends along the way, as they say, including working with the MOJ's chief data ethicist and the ethics champions, who've taken up the challenge of continuing the work on the framework and toolkit. And as I understand it, they're going to be releasing an updated and revised version very soon, and it will be available to the public. So it will be visible on the MOJ's website, where anyone can interact with it and learn from it and potentially adapt it for their own uses. In fact, our work also does continue in this space. We completed a similar but much briefer project based on a lot of this work for the Department of Business for Business and Trade late last year. They were very keen to get in on this and have a little help in guiding their adoption, their uptake, and use of AI. And we continue internally to develop the core concepts as part of what we call our AI ethics and governance and practice program, which right now is a series of 8 workbooks, 4 of which were released last year, and 4 will be released next month. And there's a link there where you can see that work is ongoing. And we intend to continue developing this work and bringing it forward and seeing how we can apply it to different realms of the public sector and more generally, and provide the ethical guidance that we understand that people can really use, particularly in the public sector, but also in the private sector, as they design, develop, and deploy artificial intelligence. So thank you for that, and we can shift to questions.
Oh, thank you so much. And I've actually seen your work on the DBT applied framework, and it was really great. Thank you so much for this presentation, for your work in general. Something I would like to follow up, if anyone else would like to also ask, I will give some the option for other people to ask questions after I ask my own. So it is always difficult to try to apply a set of principles that are generally general to a specific problem. So what do you think was maybe the more challenging or needed more thought or consideration that was specific to the criminal system?
Yeah, that's a great question. That one of the things we thought about a lot is that we didn't simply just leave it entirely to the MOJ to operationalize the principles for work. We gave them we provided a sort of a starter list of attributes, we'd call them, which are like further refinements, breaking down the principles into different ideas like bias mitigation and so on. And some of the ones that we focused on, really thinking about how the justice system is really different, were questions around things like safety, right? Because questions around safety, of course, are paramount to the mission of the Ministry of Justice, public safety. But there's so many other ideas about safety. Safety for people who are incarcerated, keeping them safe, right? Safety for court personnel who might be, in danger from unhappy, litigants, right? Safety is and then there's the mission, of course, of safety for the public. And so we try to go into that with a little bit more detail and provide awareness that these are harder questions for some than others. Accountability was another one that we focused a lot. Accountability, I think, is probably one of the most central principles for any sort of ethical system, because really at the end of the day, acting ethically is all well and good, but being able to demonstrate or to portray that to the world, to let people know, that too raised a certain number of novel questions for the justice system, because then the question is well, accountable to whom? And what levels of accountability do you have, say, to someone who's been convicted of a crime and is serving time in prison? How accountable do you need to be to them about the use of a system that you have and which you think you're using to protect the general public from them? That also goes to questions around transparency and explainability. People who are accused of crimes deserve to have systems that are being used to make decisions about them explained to them as an aspect of due process and their rights under the law. At the same time, a certain amount of information about how systems might be being used to manage them, particularly after they've been convicted, are quite sensitive and could lead to create a tension with safety for personnel, other prisoners, and so on. And so the questions, some questions that might seem, they're never easy questions, but some questions that might seem like they have fairly straightforward explanations or fairly straightforward obligations in other realms, find that the whole issue of the fact that there are people who've been accused of crimes who might be actually dangerous to the community and who themselves might be dangerous to themselves and others, and this larger mission of being responsible to the general public in a very specific, tangible way, means that some of the ethical obligations become quite knotty and quite hard to move through. So we tried our best to make clear that we were aware of that we understand that, and to provide some strategies about how to work through that and to balance these competing interests and questions.
It is always hard to achieve that balance, to be fair. Yes. Any other questions? We are running a bit over time, so I'm just a bit aware of that. Yeah, no. Job?
I can leave my question. I'll put it in the chat in the interest of time. So,
are you sure?
Yeah, well, I can ask. It's kind of following up on your question, really. So, Michael, you said it was quite difficult to operationalize. Were there some areas of the criminal justice system where it's more difficult than others, or is it just are the kind of ethical issues a bit different? Because you mentioned something about prisons. You gave a few examples there. Just wondered on your reflections on that.
Yeah, as an ethicist, I would say that our ethical obligations are kind of the same all the time, right? Which is about keeping people safe, giving people a chance, treating them like moral patients, meaning that they're deserving of rights, they're deserving of dignity and respect. Even people who are serving time in prison are deserving of dignity and respect, even if they're under supervision and so on. And so we always have those obligations. The question is how we carry them out. And as I mentioned briefly, one of the things about ethics that I think it's not really a get out of jail free card, but it is a little bit of a pass, which is that ethics is not about always having the right answer. Kant would say you're always supposed to have the right answer. There's only one answer to every question, and this is it. But I think in practice, most ethicists understand that ethics is more of a strategy. Ethics is a way of making decisions, of looking at the situation, being aware of the context you're in, being aware of the stakeholders and obligations you have, accounting for those, and then making the best decision you can. And most importantly, being able to go back and explain why you made that decision, how you backed that up, what were the ethical principles or the moral deliberation that you went through to do that. You may not have made the best decision, but at least you should be able to defend it and say that you had a moment of deliberation. You thought through. You didn't just shoot off the cuff and make a decision that may not have turned out very well. Hope that was a question. Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. If anyone has further questions, please put them in the chat, and I'm sure Michael will be happy to answer them while we have our last presentation. So the event is being recorded. If you have anything that you have to do because you're running a bit behind schedule, it will be published on the RSS YouTube channel. So probably it will take a bit of time for editing, but it will be published there. So we are really sorry we are running a bit behind schedule. But we have next Joy Aston, Policy Advisor, who will present the Algorithmic Transparency Recording Standard. Thank you, Joy, for joining, and looking forward.
No problem. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Fantastic. So good afternoon, everyone. My name's Joy. I'm Policy Advisor at the Department for Science, Innovation and Tech's Responsible Technology Adoption Unit. We were formerly the CDEI. We've just had a bit of a name change, a bit of a rebrand. So I'm here to give you a quick overview of an initiative we've been running with the Cabinet Office's Central Digital and Data Office for a few years now, and that's the Algorithmic Transparency Recording Standard, or the ATRS. I'm going to run through a bit of a background on what the standard is, and then kind of where the standard comes from and what it is, and kind of, if you want to get involved with it and complete it, you're welcome to. So as I'm sure you're all very aware, there's been what feels like an exponential increase in interest in AI as we see more and more organizations trying to think about how to make the most out of their data to save money for public sector organizations, to save money and to kind of deliver the best services. In parallel to that, we've also seen kind of increased expectations from the public for government and the wider public sector to be transparent about the use of these technologies, whether this is when these technologies are being used or the data has been collected or data is being shared. Transparency is an essential kind of component of public trust. So this situation is what gave us our problem statement for the standard. We're seeing algorithms increasingly supporting decisions being made that affect individuals, and without open and transparent communication, this can be difficult to kind of maintain and build public trust. So the solution we've come to for this particular problem is to develop the Algorithmic Transparency Recording Standard. So creating something that can help the public sector share information and communicate information clearly on their use of algorithmic tools with the general public in an accessible way. We see it as kind of a way teams can put ethical principles like transparency into practice through engaging with a tool that's been co-developed through a deep, deliberative engagement with the public and public sector, a tool that's been recognised internationally by the OECD and by other governments, and has been tried and tested extensively by teams and endorsed by the Data Standards Authority. So that's kind of a bit of background, and then I'm just going to jump straight in and kind of give you the intro as to what the ATRS actually is. So it's a standard. I'm sure data practitioners are very familiar with standards. So I'll go quite simply into the scope. In order to avoid people worrying that they have to kind of cast their net of what is an algorithm, what does that even mean? Maybe does that even include using Google search algorithms? Does that include spell check? We were like, nope, we're going to do some prioritizing to kind of help narrow down the scope. So this standard is particularly focused on tools that either have a significant influence on decision-making processes with direct or indirect public effect, or directly interact with the general public. And how is it structured? So it's got these 2 tiers of information. The first tier is almost, you can think about it kind of like a boilerplate summary for the tool. It's intended to be understandable by anyone. This 2-tiered structure came directly from that public deliberation exercise that we ran during the development of the standard, where the focus groups and the kind of other organizations we spoke to, they were saying they want to have this very clear, simple, like understandable by pretty much anyone information available in one place. And then potentially this much more detailed technical other information also available, but slightly separate. So that's where the 2-tiered structure comes from, but they are published together under one standard. And the second tier is where, that's more aimed at interested parties like civil society, journalists, anyone like that. And this is where the kind of fields are split into much more detailed components, so such as the data the algorithm's been trained on, and other such like technical details. So quickly, I'm just going to go through 2 tools that we've published records on. The Q-COVID algorithm was one developed by DHSC and NHS Digital, and this is a clinical tool helped to predict how at-risk individuals might be from coronavirus. And so there is a record published online about this. The other one is West Midlands Police developed an algorithm for exploratory analysis of sexual convictions, and this was quite an interesting and quite a different use case, and probably more of interest to this event. Then I just wanted to share a couple of testimonies. I think the one that stood out to me here is the idea that organizations kind of see the HRS as it provides a bit of a checklist of things teams can kind of think about when they're either developing or procuring a tool. It gives people questions to either take to their internal teams when they're thinking about developing these sorts of tools, or that they can take to a supplier and say, we would expect you to have answers to these questions. That allows us to kind of, try and act in best practice and kind of deliver things best. So we do have a hub on gov.uk. This is about to be updated slightly, so I'm going to send the link in the chat, but just be aware that we have kind of got a slight formatting and style and structure update to the standard and some updated guidance. This is to reflect that it's just been, we announced in the government's response to the AI regulation white paper that the standard will be mandatory for central government departments, but still obviously optional for broader public sector organisations. So we're currently updating a bit of the guidance and things in that process. So just be aware if you do have a look at it that it will change in the next week. We're also always keen to have people getting in touch to, get involved and kind of share and complete records for the tools that they are working on. We're starting off a process of like running cohorts where we bring people together so they can kind of, complete the records together and kind of work through it, and puts a bit more structure in and makes everybody's lives easier. The intention of the standard is it's not necessarily creating lots of new information. It's just bringing together these like lots of different bits of information that teams will have in different places. It's just bringing them together and communicating them clearly in one place where people can search and find all the information that they want about a tool that may be being used to make decisions about them, or that they might be interacting with directly. So please do get in touch. I'm going to just stop sharing and then I will drop the links in the chat and the email address, but open to any questions as well about the standard.
Oh, thank you so much, Joy. I'm curious to find out about more about the West Midlands Police, how they were using. Could you get a bit more? Do you know more about this?
Yeah, so this was one of the teams that kind of piloted it with us quite a while ago. So I think this tool is actually no longer in production, but it was an interesting one because it's a much more like analysis based one at kind of looking at like risk factors and different things. So it was much more on the kind of like analysis, kind of thinking about different outcomes and that. I can share the full, I think it's online. We're in this like weird in between stage where we're just about to update all of the documents and move everything over to a new repository. So I don't necessarily want to share anything and it might not actually be uploaded right now. So let me just double check. Cool, I'll just share that there. Yeah.
And just as a follow-up, because obviously all these new technology algorithms, all the new terminology everyone is using, it can be quite hard. For example, there is this tool, people should be using it. However, I think we are coming from very different backgrounds in general. So especially in a policing context, what do you think is important for, first of all, to basically make it as a standard for usage, or is it the communication, how we explain things? So what are your thoughts on this space as in bridging the gap between, because we all have come from different professions, so it can be hard to have people adhering to these standards.
Definitely. I think it's not kind of a standard, as it is a standard and it's recognized and endorsed by the DSA, but I'd say it's not like when you're thinking about like the standards with the really long numbers and the names and things, it's slightly different to that. We've kind of tried to stick with yes, Rachel, that's the link directly to the West Midlands Police one, and there is another one from Thames Valley Police in the repository as well, so feel free to take a little look. And yes, Marion is really involved with the West Midlands Police project a couple of weeks, so that's a really good point, Tom. But yeah, I see it fundamentally as it's a communications tool. It contains references to things like have you fulfilled any kind of DPIAs or kind of other like agreements and different risk assessments? What have you done when you're kind of thinking about this tool? What are the kind of processes that this tool is replacing? What was the manual process that kind of was there beforehand? So it's kind of bringing everything together and then standardizing it. So it's hopefully the way I like to see it is when, I guess, like freedom of information kind of legislation came in, obviously quite different, but that was a really long time ago and that was a really slow process. In some ways, I feel like we're still at the really early stages of algorithmic transparency and having like really effective ways to communicate with people about it. So I think it's kind of, early days still, and we're really open to like any feedback and kind of thoughts. And as we keep kind of rolling it out and engaging with more and more people, we're always kind of open to feedback and updating it and stuff. And there has been some work that's being done to like make sure it's interoperable with like other bits and pieces. So yeah, possibly more changes coming in future years. We'll see.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Any other questions for Joy? Okay, then, Joy, if you don't mind to pop your email address in the chat if you haven't. No, I don't think you have. In the chat, if anyone wants to get in touch, whether either to test the tool or for questions for anything. And I think the conversation in the chat is leading very nicely to what I was going to say next. Thank you so much for your presentation, Joy. So we are going to host another event, which is I'm also going to pop in the chat the details. It's going to be Data Ethics Committees in Policing workshop. Is a workshop which is jointly hosted by Northumbria University, the Alan Turing Institute, and the Royal Statistical Society. I'm popping in the chat the details in case anyone is interested to join. It's a hybrid event. The spaces are very limited for in person. However, you can always register online. I hope you enjoyed this event and you can join us for the next event. And thank you again to all the speakers for taking the time and sharing their work with us. It's fantastic. And the fact that we are all discussing the importance of data ethics in governance, it's a step forward in basically limiting harmful impact to society in general. So thank you very much for attending, and thank you again to all the speakers.